One of the more disgusting things I think in our world today is the idolization of celebrities. I've never really been starstruck by most people. It'd really have to be somebody pretty important for me to get starstruck. But we live in a time where, really nobody has an opinion on big things. No one cares about my thoughts, about world matters. And guess what? I don't really care about LeBron James's thoughts, or you know what I mean? I don't care about. But we live in a world where if you have this position, then people automatically look to you and say, "Well, what do you think about this or that?" And along with that, often comes this idea of service to that position or that person. I spent a little bit of time Googling, some of the extreme requests that some of these celebrities make, and they really are quite extreme, One account talked about Kanye West. He requested that his carpet be ironed because it was too lumpy. Just vacuum mine, it's okay. If you're concerned about your lumpy carpet, maybe you don't have enough issues in life, you know what I mean? But for whatever reason, we give a voice or recognition to voices that seem so detached from reality. It's just not the world we live in. Often people in those positions will also talk about how they do things for the people. But in reality, we know that's probably not true either. For the next several months, you're going to hear time and time again how people are serving the common people. My friends, don't buy the lies. Those at the top often talk about how they serve those at the bottom. They're in it to service for the people, but there's just a break in that reality. Over the next several months, we'll hear time and time again how government officials are in it for the people, but if we're honest, we know that simply just is not true. See, we live in a culture of selfishness, and I say that, but I was reminded last night talking to a guy about this. It's not really a culture issue. It's a spiritual issue. It's a spiritual issue. The selfishness is not a cultural thing. It's a spiritual thing. It started back in the garden. Satan tempts Eve with this fruit. She sees that it was pleasing to the eye, desirable to have, and so she ate from it. Because if you eat from it, you will be like God, was the promise. Make much of yourself has been the fall of humanity. We live in a world today, a religion today, where it's about making much of self. In John 13, Jesus shows us a different and a better way. John 13, look at that with me if you don't mind. Verse 1, before the feast of Passover. Look at this. I love the context that John gives us. Jesus knew that his hour had come. We've read that several times throughout John's gospel. His hour had come. We often refer to his hour as being this time where he's going to be glorified. Remember in John chapter 2 when the wine runs out and Mary comes to him and says, do something about it. And he says, what's this have to do with me? My hour has not yet come. In John 7, they were leaving for another Passover feast, and Jesus said, you all go on, my hour has not yet come, because they were at that point looking to arrest him. In John 12, as Sammy talked about last week, he acknowledged the hour of the Son of Man has come, and the Son of Man will be glorified. Jesus knew, John's telling us in John 13, Jesus knew that his hour had come. He was soon to depart from this world to the Father. He had, at this point, the cross in his horizons. Look at the end of verse 1. Having loved his own who were in the world, he loved them to the end. The word world there is going to be important as we go through the next couple of chapters. From chapters 13 to chapter 17, in these last few moments with his disciples, the word world will be used 40 times. And I need you to understand this is not just a generic usage of the word. In chapter 13 through 17, when John writes about the world, He's using it as this sharp contrast to the world and the people who follow Jesus. Remember John 3:16, God so loved the world that he sent his only son. Now in chapters 13 through 17, this world is the dividing line between the people who follow Jesus, Jesus' disciples, and the rest of humanity. Jesus was rejected by his own people, in John's language, in chapter 12. The Jews wanted nothing to do with him. They were plotting to kill him. And so Jesus withdraws from them and spends his last few moments with his disciples pouring into him. He loved them, and it says he loved them to the end. I think that's an interesting phrase, to the end. Now that could be read, he loved them absolutely, and absolutely he did. He loved them completely, a perfect type of love. We can also read this, he loved them to the end, that being the end of his life. What we're about to see in John 13 is an expression of complete love from Jesus to his disciples with the cross on the horizon. Now verse 2 gives us a little bit of a turn. Verse 2 says, during supper, when the devil had already put into the heart of Judas Iscariot, Simon's son, to betray him. Now this is interesting. Now I probably spend more time here than I should, but I just want to ask, because this comes up often. What do we do with supernatural things we read about? And here's the big question that comes out. During supper, when the devil had already put it into the heart of Judas Iscariot. Who put it there? The devil. You ever heard the phrase, the devil made me do it? Have you ever used the phrase, the devil made me do it? Well, how do we handle a passage like this? What is the connection or the control that the devil might have over me, over you? Next week, we'll see in verse 27, after he had taken the morsel, Judas had taken the morsel, Satan entered into him, and Jesus says, what you're going to do quickly. It brings us to this question that's so incredibly important. What power does the devil have over us, if any? What control does he have over us? Just this past week, I had this come up. It was asked, can Satan hear our thoughts? Can Satan hear our silent prayers? What do we do with these supernatural things? There's a lot that could be said about angels and demons and supernatural things, and we don't have time today, but I do want to give you a few basic principles as we walk forward. As we see this text and as we walk forward in our lives, a few things to remember that will help us, okay? Number one, remember this. Satan and his demons are created beings. See, that's very important. Often we have this picture of the good versus the bad, the light and the dark, good versus evil, equal and opposing forces. That's not what we see in Scripture. It's not equal and opposing forces. It's much more like me playing 1v1 with Michael Jordan. Okay? He's better than me. Even at 65, whatever he is, he's better at me. All right? He is. He will shoot better than me. He can handle the ball better than me. He can do it all better than me. It's not equal and opposing. It's different. But here's the thing. I'm playing Michael Jordan. He's going to beat me. I know that. But I can guarantee he won't make every shot. I can trip him. You know what I mean? I will foul him. All right? Like, he will beat me, but he won't make every shot. And that's kind of how it is with Satan. Satan is not an equal opponent to God. Satan is a fallen angel. He's not a fallen God. So it's important for us to remember that Satan is a created being. God created Satan and the demons. Colossians 1 verse 16, speaking of Jesus, it says, for by him, being Jesus, all things were created, in heaven and on earth, visible and invisible, whether thrones or dominions or rulers or authorities, all things were created through him and for him. Satan was created. He is not eternal. He is not all-powerful. Nehemiah 9 says, you are the Lord, you alone. You've made the heavens and the heaven of heavens and all their hosts. So remember, Satan and his demons are created. Now, when were they created? We don't really know. We know in Job 38, it speaks of the heavenly hosts celebrating at the moment of creation. So they pre-existed us, but they were created. They were created, not only were they created, they were also created with limitation. They were created with limitation. See, they were created with spatial limitation. They can't be everywhere at once. God can be. God is. But Satan and his demons are not. They are limited. Daniel 10 speaks of Daniel petitioning the Lord for help and God dispatching an angel, but that angel is withheld because in Daniel 10, the prince of Persia for 30 days or something like that. Okay, that's a demonic deity. It's a demonic thing that withheld this messenger from getting to Daniel. They have spatial limitations. They have authority limitations. They can't just do what they want. Job 1, Job has to petition the requests of God to be able to bring torment to Job. One of my favorite passages dealing with this is Mark 1. Mark 1, Jesus is in Capernaum, and he's teaching in the synagogue as he did, and everyone's astonished at his teaching. And as he's teaching, there came a man who was possessed with an unclean spirit. And look at what he says in verse 24. He says, what have you to do with us, Jesus of Nazareth? Have you come to destroy us? I know who you are, the Holy One of God. And with that, Jesus rebuked him and cast him out. And the people are shocked and amazed. Who is this man, speaking of Jesus, who has this authority? Not only is he teaching with authority, but even the unclean spirits listen to him. These fallen angels, we call them demons, they don't have unlimited authority. But they obey the authority of Jesus. Here's what you need to understand. They were created and they are not equal to God in any way, shape, or form. Satan is real. His demons are real. Sometimes we neglect that in the world today, in the church today. We think of the love of God. We don't really think about the fact that Satan's scheming. He's scheming because there is a threat there. Ephesians 6, Paul says, put on the whole armor of God that you may be able to stand against the schemes of the devil. Friends, Satan wants to hijack your faith. He wants to hijack your life. He wants to make you self-absorbed, self-interested, interested in anything other than God. But Satan is not all-powerful. That's why John, who wrote this gospel, also writes as an encouraging word in 1 John chapter 4. Little children, he says, you're from God, and you have overcome them. For he who is in you is greater than he who is in the world. I say all that today to say this. Our concern ought not be to avoid Satan and his demons. Our focus, our attention ought to be on following God and his ways, and he'll take care of the rest. So then, what do we do with Judas? See, God is supremely more powerful than Satan, so what do we do with our text? See, we see that Judas was hung up on money. John tells us that he was hung up on money. He was upset in chapter 12 at in his words, the waste of money that was spent on anointing Jesus. So he was caught up with this money thing. Both Luke and John speak of Satan entering Judas in order to betray Jesus. But here's the point. All the gospel writers, they still hold Judas responsible for his actions. While Satan entered him, how and why is not important to the gospel writers, but in their writing they make it very clear that Judas is still responsible for what he has done. We don't know why Judas chose to betray Jesus. Some speculate it's because of the waste of money and all that in John chapter 12. Some speculate that maybe he's trying to force Jesus' hand. See, they expected a military leader who would overthrow Rome, and maybe we can cause a coup in order to get Jesus arrested so that he will so we can force him to get his army together and overthrow Rome. Maybe that's a possibility. We don't know what motivated him clearly, but we do know this. As soon as he decides to betray Jesus, he is now acting in unison with Satan. While Satan influenced Judas, it's critical to understand that Judas still had free will to choose his actions, and the Bible authors hold Judas accountable for his betrayal, emphasizing that even under temptation, you and I are responsible for our choices. The devil made me do it is not a reliable excuse. And that's what makes John chapter 13 so powerful. We haven't even gotten to the good part yet. John chapter 13, Jesus, the set's being set. The disciples are there. We assume they're all there. But Judas is mentioned specifically. His betrayal is mentioned specifically. Now the feast of Passover was at hand. Jesus knew in verse 1 that his hour had come to depart from the world to the Father. Having loved his own who were in the world, he loved them to the end. During supper, when the devil had already put into the heart of Judas Iscariot, Simon's son, to betray him, watch what Jesus does. Jesus, knowing that the Father had given all things into his hands, power, authority, influence. He knew that he had come from God and was going back to God. He rose from supper and called lightning from heaven to strike Judas for his betrayal. No, that's what we would expect. No, he rose from supper, he laid aside his outer garments, and taking a towel, he tied it around his waist, and then he poured water into a basin and began to wash the feet of the disciples and wipe them with a towel that was wrapped around him. Jesus, the master who took the role of a servant, washing his disciples' feet, even Judas's, even the one who he knew was going to betray him. It's interesting, throughout Jesus' earthly ministry, there's no indication that Judas was treated any differently, even though Jesus knew that it was Judas who would betray him. It appears that the other disciples had no indication that it was Judas either. As we'll see next week in the second half of John 13, when Jesus says, someone's going to betray me, one of you will betray me, they all ask in unison, Lord, is it I? Perhaps they understood what we often fail to understand. We're all on the verge of betraying Jesus each day. As a matter of fact, John tells us that Judas was the money keeper for the disciples. The fact that Judas had the bank, he was the banker of the crew, that may very well depict or imply a leadership position amongst the disciples. Yet Jesus never treated Judas any differently, even though he knew Judas would hand him over. He rose from supper, he laid aside his outer garments, taking a towel tied around his waist. He poured water into a basin and began to wash the disciples' feet, even Judas's. Can you imagine? I know how I treat the people who have wronged me in the past. But knowing that this person will wrong me, how do you treat those people? It's such an amazing thing. Jesus washes their feet. Now, surely the disciples would have been happy perhaps to wash Jesus' feet, but to wash one another's feet, probably not. This was a task that was usually reserved for the lowest of servants. Peers would not wash a peer's feet. In fact, in some Jewish literature I found this past week, you have Jewish rabbis who take their mothers to court, and their legal system took them to court because the mothers insisted on washing their feet, and it was dishonoring for their mother to wash their feet and all this stuff. Peers would not wash their peers' feet. About a week earlier, Jesus had a dialogue with these disciples as they're walking down the road. They're having a conversation as to who's the greatest. You recall that in Mark chapter 10. They're talking about who's the greatest, probably because this dinner is approaching. Jesus got them together and says, don't you understand that those who are considered rulers over the Gentiles, they lord it over. They lord over their position. Their great ones exercise authority over them, but it shall not be so among you. But whoever would be great among you must be your servant. And whoever would be first among you must be slave of all. For even the Son of Man came not to be served, but to serve, and to give his life as a ransom for many. This was the conversation that Jesus had with his disciples just a few days before this foot washing. When they would have come to this upper room that night, they would have walked into the room, and customarily there would be a servant standing there with a basin to wash their feet. But this time there's no servant available. Just a basin sitting there. And now, this evening, as they walk in and they pause and they look and they see no servant, just a basin, now they have a decision to make. Now, I can wash my own feet, done it before. Twice. I could, I suppose, take the position of service and wash everyone else's feet. Or I can act like I never saw it. It seems on this night they acted like they never saw it. Now, the other thing to kind of picture in your head is the fact that this Last Supper, it's not happening at a table like you and I sit at. This would have been a U-shaped table that you'll see on the screen behind me. This U-shaped table is kind of an interesting thing. You sit on a short coffee table size table. You lean usually on your left arm and eat with your right. On this day, they would have been laying around this table after no servants at the door. They would have come and found their place and their feet radiating from the center of the table. It's from this position that Jesus got up and started to wash the feet of his disciples. Now, Luke gives us some interesting facts here, and this is just because I'm a geek. I want to share it with you. We can somewhat put together who was sitting where. Luke gives us some interesting facts. In this type of a seating arrangement, the host would sit in the left wing in the second position. And on his right would be a guest of honor, and on his left would be a guest of honor. So the guest of honor would sit on his left. On the host's right would be the second important. And then it would go to the third most important row would be on the left of the guest of honor. And so on until you get around to the end of the table. Now we can reconstruct where some of the disciples are sitting. For example, in John 21, it says, Peter turned and he saw the disciple whom Jesus loved. We know that to be John the author. And he tells us he's the one who also had leaned back against him, being Jesus, during the Last Supper. If someone's sitting on their left elbow and leaning back against Jesus, well, that puts him on the right of Jesus. All right? On the left of Jesus would have been Judas. We know that, I think, because in John 13, Jesus says, the one who I give this morsel to when it's dipped. Judas and Jesus apparently share a bowl, which would have been customary with the guest of honor. So Judas Iscariot, interestingly enough, is the guest of honor, perhaps at this dinner. We can somewhat place where Peter was as well. Now this is speculating here. But look in chapter 13, verse 23. One of the disciples whom Jesus loved was reclining at Jesus' side. So he's on the right of Jesus. So Simon Peter motioned to him and asked him who Jesus was speaking of. Now, looking back at this diagram again, if John is on the right of Jesus, leaning on his left arm, the only person that could easily motion to John would probably be Peter, who's in the position of least importance. Now, fun little fact, again, I'm speculating here, but just a few days prior to this, Jesus has this conversation about if you want to be great, you need to serve others. The first will be last and the last will be first. So I wonder if this night Peter walked in and he saw no servant and people are trying to get their positions at the table. I wonder if Peter went and found his spot at the end Of course, I can only speculate as to why. Like, what motivated him? I don't know. But it could be the thing that would motivate me and you. Well, I'll take the position of least importance. Maybe Jesus will notice my humble heart and promote me to a position of power. I don't know what motivated Peter to sit in that position, but I find it interesting if you look as we continue through John 13. Peter has a dialogue with Jesus. And Peter has a dialogue with Jesus because some commentators suggest that if there's not a servant in the house to take care of washing the feet, the guest of least importance would naturally take that responsibility upon himself. On this night, Peter did not take that responsibility. If that's the case, then it makes these next few verses very rich. He came to Simon Peter, who said to him, "Lord, you wash my feet?" Jesus answered, "What I'm doing now you don't understand, but afterward you will understand." And Peter said, "Well, you shall never wash my feet." Jesus answered him, "If I do not wash you, you have no share with me." Peter initially resists Jesus' act of service, not understanding its significance. Perhaps he was embarrassed because Jesus was now doing the job that Peter should have done. But I think it highlights another realization for us as well. Peter rejects Jesus washing his feet. And Jesus says, if you don't wash, you have no share with me. But it reminds me of how often we try to live with Jesus as an additive to our life. Jesus, you can have it all except for this. Don't wash this. Don't wash this part. I like this part. Everything else is yours, Jesus, but don't try to mess with this. The ultimate question comes down to this: is Jesus my Lord or not? Jesus wants to wash parts of our lives that sometimes we don't want him to wash. And Jesus' warning to Peter is the same to us. If I don't wash it, I have nothing to do with it. Am I your Lord or not? Peter responds, I like Peter because he's always extreme. "Lord, not my feet, but also my hands and my head." And Jesus said, "The one who is bathed doesn't need to wash except for his feet, but is completely clean. You are clean, though not every one of you." John tells us, and Jesus knew who would betray him. That's why he said, "Not all of you are clean." And when he washed their feet, he put on his outer garments and resumed his place. And he said to them, "Do you understand what I've done to you?" And I can picture the room, everyone. No. "You call me teacher and Lord, and you're right, for I am so. If I then, your Lord and your teacher, have washed your feet, you also ought to wash one another's feet. I've given you an example that you should do as I've done for you." Jesus calls his disciples to follow his example of humble service. If I do that, then you should also. Just as Jesus washed the feet of his disciples, including his betrayer, you and I are called to serve others selflessly. This means putting aside our pride, our prejudices, to show love in humility in everyday interactions, reflecting Jesus' love, his example. Jesus calls his disciples to follow his example of humble service. And Paul will echo this later in Philippians chapter 2, telling us that we should have the same mind of Christ, who made himself nothing, but took up the very nature of a servant. We're called to serve one another in love, following Jesus' example. My question for you today is, how's your serve? How's your serve? How do you display this? You know, essentially Jesus acted out a parable for his disciples. Jesus knew that people remember better what you do more than what you say. And so he wanted to teach the proud, the arguing disciples about humility. And so he didn't just say it, he showed it. And in reality, what he illustrated on that night, washing the feet, illustrates his work as a whole. When you came in, you should have gotten one of these communion cups. I want to point out to you the parallels of what Jesus does on this night, washing feet, and what he did on the cross. Because it's a beautiful illustration. In John chapter 13, Jesus rose from supper from a place of rest and comfort, reclining at the table. About 2,000 years ago, Jesus rose from his throne in heaven, from a place of rest and comfort. In John chapter 13, Jesus laid aside his garments, taking out his outer garments. 2,000 years ago, Jesus rose from his throne and took his divinity and put it aside. In John chapter 13, he put a towel around his waist and prepared himself for work. 2,000 years ago, Jesus took off his divinity and put on humanity, taking the form of a servant ready to work. In John chapter 13, Jesus poured water into a basin ready to clean. 2,000 years ago, Jesus poured out his blood to cleanse us from guilt and the penalty of sin. In John chapter 13, Jesus sat down again after he washed their feet. After Jesus' death, burial, and resurrection, he ascended into heaven and sat down again at the right hand of God the Father. Each week when we eat of this bread and drink from this cup, we're reminded of his wonderful sacrifice. We're reminded of his service in his body, and his blood poured out. In verse 16, he says, "Truly, truly, I say to you, a servant is not greater than his master, nor is a messenger greater than the one who sent him. If you know these things, blessed are you if you do them." Jesus promises a blessing for those who follow his example of service. So I ask you this morning, do you want blessing in your life? Serve others. Follow his example. Don't assume a posture of being better than others, but humble yourself. At the same time, don't resist others serving you. When we serve others, we experience a joy and a blessing that comes from living our faith in very practical ways. So I want to challenge you today to follow Christ's example. Humble service. How's your service? You know, there's a passage that we referred to earlier in Philippians chapter 2 that I think is one of the most important, applicable passages that we could look to. If we were able to embody the teaching of John 13 and Philippians 2, if we were able to embody that in our marriages, everything would change. If we're able to embody this in our parenting, everything would change. If we were able to embody this with our employee and employer relationships, everything would change. Paul writes, "Do nothing out of selfish ambition or conceit, but in humility count others more significant than yourselves. Let each of you look not only to his own interests, but to the interest of others." Boy, how my marriage would change if I did that. "Have this mind amongst yourselves, which is yours in Christ Jesus, who, though he was in the form of God, did not count equality with God something to be grasped, But he emptied himself, taking the form of a servant, being born in the likeness of man, being found in human form, he humbled himself by becoming obedient to the point of death, even death on the cross. How would my relationships, my life change if I embodied that type of living? Therefore, in verse 9, God exalted him and bestowed upon him the name that is above every name. That at the name of Jesus, every knee should bow in heaven and on earth and under the earth, and every tongue confess Jesus Christ is Lord, to the glory of God the Father. My friends, can I challenge you today? Our service, our posture in this world has a direct impact on every tongue confessing Jesus Christ is Lord. So I ask you today, how's your serve?